Welcome to the Glenhurst ArTeach video series. In this episode, artist Amanda McCaver shares with us about her art practice and techniques to get started working with textiles. Amanda's art often involves a combination of sewing, knitting, and weaving to achieve striking, dreamlike forms. Amanda, you use embroidery to make the most beautiful large-scale installations. I'd love to know more about, how did you start this kind of art? How'd you get into this?
So it's a little bit of a story, but I was taking a class at York University and we were thinking about drawing. And we had all sorts of different disciplines in the class. We were having painters and dancers. And basically in the class, we were thinking about a drawing as anything that had to do with line. So I started to think about how interesting the line of thread is because it seems so slight, but it actually is really sculptural. And then I sort of made up this art problem for myself where I said, I want to make a drawing out of thread. I don't want it to have a base. I want it to sort of be existing free form, but I had no idea how to do it. So that was sort of the start of my journey. And I'm still really interested in the way that textiles can occupy space. But I'm also interested in this idea of a line or a drawing in space.
What's so interesting, I think, about the work you do, and you can see some of it, the prints behind us, is that you're working with such small, like you say, small lines, but they take up such big space. How do you envision that work in your head before you start? Or are you just kind of experimenting as you go and see what happens?
Well, it's interesting. A lot of my installations consist of those small units and a small, slight line that accumulates to create something much larger. So for me, it's that sort of small gesture that can accumulate to create something that feels enveloping, that feels like something you can be within. And then there's also sort of a practical side to it that it's really easy to store small units. And it's been a way for me to sort of build my practice and start to kind of create pieces that can exist very large or very small. So the work kind of has a breadth to it. When it's in a gallery space, it's very big. And then when I'm storing it in my studio, it can condense down really small. Yeah.
Now, I feel like with large-scale installation art, it's really like you're talking with that Glenhurst show with the furniture. It's really, you take up a huge space. And so it's not just something you're looking at the wall. It's something you're kind of existing in. And so how are you kind of working? What is the experience of the person looking at your art that you're hoping they're having when they're seeing these big installation projects?
Well, I hope that there's a feeling of sort of being within the work and existing in the art. With the room installations, I was thinking of them sort of like a painting, you stand at one point and you see the work and then you can sort of move around it. But with some of the other pieces that are more like these spirograph shapes that are hanging in space, there's a piece that are thousands of these. I'm thinking a lot about people moving and walking through the space and the different angles that you can get as you move. I also really like when people lay underneath the piece. So for me, it's kind of about being within the work, being in the moment, and sort of having this dreamlike environment that you can exist within while you're in the gallery.
Oh, that's such a beautiful experience. Tell me about color, because I feel like you use color in such an interesting way. And like you're saying, when people can look at things from different angles and you're working with something that you can see through and you can see the colors around the room. How do you use color in exposition when you're putting something together?
Well, color is a big part of my joy of making. I've done some pieces that are fluorescent threads, and I was really interested in the way that the fluorescent threads sort of cast light into the space, creating sort of a glow. But with things like the room installation or floating garden, I was looking to children's storybooks and sort of the color palette of, a soft watercolor. I really liked Beatrix Potter's use of color. So I think about what our connections are to color and how that might be communicated in the work. So color is a huge thing that I think about because I think it can communicate a lot of feeling.
So I know you teach young people, and I'm sure people ask you all the time because you're such a wonderful, accomplished textile artist. But if someone wants to get started in textile art, what are your suggestions? What are your actionable items people could take away from this?
Well, I'd say pick up a book, like a how-to book. I learned a lot from McCall's Needlework Treasury, but you can learn a lot from books. And I would say also just get your hands on materials and be curious. So you can learn a lot in terms of technique from books, but you can also learn a lot from just trying things.
So tell me a little bit about actually making an installation piece. Like, obviously you have a studio and a sewing machine and different color thread. How do you actually go about creating this art that you do?
So it usually starts with a drawing for me. So I usually work from paper. I often make models and maquettes. My studio space is really small. So oftentimes when I'm first installing these big installation pieces, the first time I've seen the work is when I'm putting it up in the gallery. But I really think it's so important to, at least for me, to test things out and see what they look like. I think the material says and does a lot, so you have to sort of test that. And once I'm done with the prototype stage, which also includes sort of hanging the work up and seeing what it does, I spend months, years making the work. So I spend full days in the studio. I'm at my sewing machine a lot of that time. It's not always peaceful. The sound of the sewing machine is something. I wear earplugs. And sometimes I think in the creative process, it's frustrating. You're taking these risks. Sometimes things don't work out. And my sewing machine and I sometimes fight. So there's a little bit of push-pull for me in the studio. I'll encounter challenges and have to sort of work to overcome them. But with the pieces that are multiples, I'm often sort of continuing to build and work on the installations like years and years and years just to get the volume that I want in the piece.
Yeah, I can see how when you do this for work and you're in it every day, that it's not always going to be relaxing, right? You're trying to think ahead and you're trying to decide where to go. And, is it easy to get up in your head when you're doing this for a living and it's also your art and your passion?
Definitely. Yeah, I think that there's challenges for sure in just sort of moving beyond those challenges and also spending all that time alone. You can really get sort of internal. So I do love listening to podcasts, and any music recommendations, I'm pretty quick to to listen to them.
So I wonder if you would tell me a little bit about how you got into textile art specifically, like when that was kind of revealed to you as your specific art form.
Sure. So it really started in that class that I was talking about where we were exploring drawing. And for me, it was sort of like a slow reveal to get to the point of making large installation work. When I graduated from school, I applied to Harbourfront Center's Artist in Residence program. And that sort of revealed to me like sort of the range of textile work and the range of ways that you can be a designer or artist working in textiles and fiber. And as a part of Harbourfront, we were sort of building your portfolio in the 3-year residency, and my work started to get bigger. So a big first step for me was moving away from the wall. And then another step was to go big. I was making a lot of work that was sort of this size or like this size. I really like, making smaller work. So moving larger and then thinking about how to occupy space in different ways. But it was something that I slowly built upon and like slowly started to sort of manifest in the work. So I think that there's always room for artwork to grow and change. And even now I'm feeling like a change and shift in my work. I'm thinking about how to make wire pieces, a line that exists in space in a different kind of way. But I think for me, that process of becoming a textile artist sort of happened like little baby steps at a time.
Amanda, this is all super intricate work, and I know it's probably hard to see, but I just wonder if you can give me a sense of like, with work that's so fine like this, how do you actually go through the process of creating stuff like this?
Sure. So I use a sewing machine to do most of my work, and I sew into a fabric that dissolves in water. So if you can picture it, it's a surface that I can use my sewing machine to stitch into. And I start to create strength in the textile when the lines cross. So when I'm getting those lines crossing, I'm building up strength as well as building the image. So I'm sort of thinking about two things when I'm at the sewing machine. So for something like this is like a spirograph inspired piece, which is great because there's lots of connection points, which means it's going to be a strong textile. But all of this sort of fuzzy white stuff is the fabric that will wash away. So you sort of go from something like this that has a lot of fabric to it to something a little bit more lace-like, like this. So I've sort of done a bunch of different things. So you can see like in the living room piece, I'm sort of doing some shading. And then there's other pieces that are a little bit more lace-like. This one's on a string, which is kind of fun. And then I've also done some sculptural pieces that sort of exist in space. So it's a lot of trial and error. Like I can see this piece here was something I did early on, really lace-like and loose. And then I've also done things that are a bit more solid like this, which has a lot more stitching and sort of fabric in it.
One of my questions, I think, is we talked about the big kind of installation art you do. How does your art kind of work into other mediums? Because I know there's kind of different things that you're doing with your art at the moment.
Definitely, and that's been happening more in the last year than sort of ever before. So I sometimes work from drawings to textiles, and then recently those textiles have sometimes been moving into other mediums. So I did a mural for Harbourfront Center this summer, which was really great, sort of spirograph shapes. And then I'm also thinking about the ways that sort of some of these lines and structures, like this leaf form here, could maybe be translated into wire, and I'm building a wire sculpture. So just some different ways to sort of translate the imagery into other materials.
Absolutely. Now, is it nerve-wracking to create a piece of work and never have seen it in the space until you set it up?
Yeah, it's like nerve-wracking and exciting. It's like the best and worst part. But sometimes I think of the gallery space as my studio, right? So I'm sort of making up the lines for the project in my studio space, and then I'm bringing those lines and continuing to sort of draw within the space of the gallery as the work gets installed.
When you're working on a project, or a project's kind of becoming a project in your mind, where are you getting that inspiration from? How are you deciding what the next project is?
Yeah, so I think a lot about memory and sort of nostalgia, and a lot of the work sort of comes from that place. I walk a lot. I like to go on walks around the neighborhood, and I think walking is a great pace for sort of coming up with ideas, but also being sort of visually stimulated. And as you can see here, there's a lot of sort of botanical inspiration. I think a lot about repeated forms in nature and how nature builds form. And then I bring that into some of my projects. And I love the idea of sort of building spaces that are dreamlike and have a sense of sort of wonder to them. And I think that is part of why I like to make work.
When you have people interact with your artwork, what's kind of the end goal? What are you hoping everyone's walking away with?
Well, I hope when they're in the pieces, experiencing the work, that they're sort of transported into a different kind of space, a different kind of looking, and maybe a different kind of presence in the work. And when they leave, I want them to be sort of left with that memory of the piece, but then also maybe see those details. I think that there's a lot in this work that is really detail oriented. It's about like noticing those small things and how those small things add up into something larger. And that's something that I'd like for people to sort of take with them and use that same type of looking when they're going on a walk or looking at a painting.
Amanda, thank you so much for sharing your inspiration and your art with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
If you enjoyed this episode, please click the subscribe button below. Give us a like or visit our channel for more videos in the Glenhurst ArTeach series. You can also stay up to date with everything Glenhurst at glenhurst.ca.